Hi friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. Recently, one of our viewers named John contacted me on Facebook. He asked, Alan, why didn't the Jedi just use the cloning process to increase their numbers during the Clone Wars, and would that have saved them from Order 66? He also asked me, Alan, why are you so goddamn likable and respected? Thanks, John, for the questions. Let's see what we can do. First, let's talk about the cloning process. At the time of the Clone Wars, at least according to legends, there were several different cloning centers across the galaxy. They were mainly used to create private security forces and private workforces. Basically, dangerous or mundane jobs that could be cheaper if using a base template of clones instead of hiring individuals who would need to be paid and have a life outside of work. Clones were essentially slaves to whoever bought them. All you had to do was pay for the upfront costs and then some maintenance fees. Now, because of how advanced droids and machines were, clone workforces weren't all that popular. Most people just preferred using machines. But that didn't mean there wasn't enough business to go around. There were a few cloning centers in the galaxy, but they weren't all of the same quality. You had Legends companies like Spartai Creations. Their cloning cylinders were quite advanced and could produce a full adult clone within just a year. But because of this short development time, the clones that were produced weren't the smartest or most skilled. They were trained through a process known as flash learning, where information and memories were literally written onto the brain. And one of the side effects of this shorter development period was something known as clone madness, which would lead to a clone going crazy and being extremely violent. Needless to say, if the Jedi were to clone themselves, they most likely would be looking for something a bit higher quality. Otherwise, a Jedi clone might get clone madness, which will lead to a lot of people dying and some really bad PR. Now, it was actually a Jedi Master Sifo Dyas who first approached the Kaminoan cloning facilities to contract them to create the Grand Army of the Republic. The Kaminoans were a relatively secretive people, little known to the rest of the galaxy. As a matter of fact, after they took the contract to create the clone army, their planet was even removed from all Republic databases. The Kaminoans as a species had survived the catastrophic environmental disaster that caused the oceans on their planets to rise and cover all their landmasses. They were able to survive through a very harsh and clinical selective process where the Kaminoans basically purged all the weakest members of their society. What remained was a proud species that was obsessed with genetic purity and suffered from an extreme superiority complex. They were, however, excellent at making clones, perhaps the best in the galaxy. Now, creating an exact genetic copy like how they made Boba Fett was quite an easy process. But creating one genetic sample and then modifying it for mass production or a certain type of profession was an extremely hard thing to do. While Jango Fett was one of the best fighters in the entire galaxy, he was considered way too independent and even aggressive to be a good conventional soldier. The Kaminoan cloners had to adjust certain genetic markers in his DNA to make sure that the clones were more compliant and docile. Another problem that they faced was the growth process of an adult human being just took way too long. But the Kaminoans knew that shorter growth times led to many more problems in a clone, so they limited their clone's growth to twice the rate of your average human, which meant that it took around 10 years for a clone to fully mature. Or around 15 years if they're a millennial. But even then, they'll do something childish with their life, like become a YouTuber. The Kaminoans had to do several different tests with the genetic templates and made many different batches of clones before they finally figured out something that would work well for mass production. Now, there are some benefits for the Jedi Order to use clones. For one, you can alter the genetic markers to increase midichlorian counts. You can also alter other genetic markers to decrease the amount of emotions that an individual can have. The problem was this was an extremely lengthy process, something the Jedi probably wouldn't have had enough time for. The Jedi Order found out about the Kaminoan cloning facility just 3 years before Order 66 happened. A 3-year developmental cycle would fall way below what the Kaminoans were comfortable with working with, and the Jedi would also probably want the most stable clones possible. However, I can see the Kaminoans going to great lengths to accommodate the Jedi Order's wishes. As scientists, they were extremely interested in getting their hands on the genetic material of Force-sensitive individuals. And they even asked several Jedi who were working with them during the Clone Wars to do so, but most of them refused. This was because cloning a Jedi would be considered pretty taboo. The Jedi Council was pretty conservative when it came to doing experiments with Force users. The Jedi Temple even had their own Jedi-trained physicians and doctors. Most Jedi consider genetic alteration or testing on Force-sensitive individuals as taboo and altering the nature of the Force. Which is probably why most of the talented Force-using scientists and researchers were usually Sith. The Jedi saw themselves as servants of the Force and living conduits of it. They didn't really question how it worked or try to alter things. The Sith, however, saw themselves as masters of the Force and sought to bend it towards their will. Darth Plagueis and Darth Sidious were the first Force users in the modern age to create life from nothing but the Force. They also brought a dead individual back to life by preventing the midichlorians in their body from leaving. So the Sith were more likely to experiment and question the nature of the Force, whereas the Jedi kind of just let it be. This is also why individuals like Qui-Gon Jinn were almost banished from the Jedi Order because of their curiosity. Furthermore, a lot of the Force altercation methods came from Sith alchemy and Sith science. So there is this deeper ideological reason why the Jedi wouldn't clone themselves. However, one could argue by the time of the Clone Wars, the Jedi Order had already lost their way. They fought blindly for the Republic without questioning the true purpose behind the war. In the past, the Jedi Order have participated in wars before, but most of the time it is directly against the Sith Empire. Although the Separatists did have Sith influences, I wouldn't necessarily label their entire movement as a part of the Sith ideology. During the Mandalorian Wars, the Mandalorians were also puppets of Sith Lords, but only the Revan faction of the Jedi Order fought alongside the Republic against the Mandalorians. The rest of the Jedi Council actually disagreed. And in the end, the Jedi Council was right. Revan led most of his Jedi to death, destruction, or the dark side. So by the time of the Clone Wars, the Jedi might have been more open to the possibility of cloning themselves to increase their numbers. Now, most likely they would have approached the Kaminoans because they are the premier cloners in the galaxy. They also have a pre-established working relationship with these guys. Also, they're probably the only ones that can really pull off something as complicated as cloning a Force-sensitive individual. For one reason or another, cloning Force-sensitive individuals was always more difficult than cloning non-Force-sensitive individuals. There have been a few attempts in Legends, but they almost always go wrong. In the Dark Empire series, after the fall of the Galactic Empire, Palpatine had several clones which he possessed with his Force spirits. But because these bodies weren't connected through the Force and heavily depended on dark side Force energy, they deteriorated relatively quickly, forcing Palpatine to quickly switch bodies numerous times. This was hardly sustainable on a larger scale and only worked because Palpatine had access to so many freaking clones of himself. Before Palpatine had died, he also experimented with cloning Force-sensitive individuals. Several Jedi before the Clone Wars partook in a mission known as Outbound Flight, which was an exploratory mission to the edge of the known galaxy and beyond. Leading that mission was the Jedi Master Joruus C'baoth. Disguised as a medical test, Palpatine had all the members of the Outbound Flight team give them his DNA samples. Using a Spartai cloning cylinder, he cloned Jedi Master C'baoth. Now, as we mentioned before, the Spartai cloning cylinders usually produce clones in 1 year, and this oftentimes created insane clones. The clone of Joruus C'baoth also suffered from this side effect and had a very erratic personality and quickly turned into a Dark Jedi. Now, it should be mentioned that the real Joruus C'baoth was quite headstrong and arrogant, and that eventually led to him turning to the dark side anyway, so it is possible that this personality trait was transferred to the clone and was not the original cause of him turning to the dark side. But again, if the Jedi Order were to clone themselves, I would highly recommend them stay away from the Spartai cloning cylinders. Darth Vader also conducted his own experiments when his secret apprentice Galen Marek died. He preserved his body and tried to clone him using the Kamino facilities. By this time, the Kaminoan cloners were all dead and gone because they had foolishly started an uprising against the Empire during the rise of the New Order. Darth Vader had to replace these irreplaceable Kaminoan scientists with far inferior Imperial techs and scientists. They encountered many difficulties during the cloning process. The first clones of Galen Marek were only a few weeks old and suffered from severe deformities and clone madness. It was hypothesized that the Force itself was preventing a successful clone from being created. Another huge obstacle was that the original Galen Marek's memories had to be implanted in all of the new clones in order for them to be able to use their body's Force powers. These memories caused an identity crisis in the clones and eventually led to madness. Now, after several months of failed experiments and several hundreds of failed clones, they finally made one stable Galen Marek. This clone was seemingly attached to the previous memories of his original template, but was relatively under control of his own actions and powers. So, by now we can see it's possible to clone a Force-sensitive individual, retain all their Force powers and midichlorian counts. But the real difficulty lies in creating a mentally stable Force user. It's just not that easy. The biggest problem with the cloning process, whether you're using a Spartai cloning cylinder or a Kaminoan one, is that if you didn't give the clones enough time to develop, they would eventually deteriorate into madness. Now, there is one last case I do want to talk about, and that's with the legendary species known as the Kamite. The Kamite's entire population was made up of clones. They had long forgotten how to naturally procreate, and they believed in selective cloning. Oddly enough, they saw Force sensitivity in an individual as an unwanted mutation. But nonetheless, occasionally one of these clones would become Force sensitive. One of these clones, named Dorsk-81, would go on to join Luke's legendary New Jedi School. Dorsk-81 was not only a mentally stable individual, he was also an exemplary Jedi and fully embraced the teachings of the school. He ultimately died performing what is widely known as one of the most powerful Force pushes in galactic history against an Imperial Remnant Star Destroyer over Yavin 4. So I guess it is possible to create a stable Jedi clone, but it's not easy. So to answer the question why the Jedi Order didn't just clone themselves in order to survive Order 66, well, for one, cloning a Jedi is probably against most Jedi's view of the Force. And even if the Jedi Order was comfortable with the cloning process, there's a very high chance that the clones that they do make will go crazy and start killing everyone, especially with the limited amount of time that the Jedi would have to react to Order 66. Now, during Order 66 and Rise of the New Order, the Kaminoans did go against the Empire, and they most likely did something similar in canon, so it is possible for the Jedi to seek shelter on Kamino, but I think any large gathering of Jedi on any planet would attract the attention of Darth Vader, and they would eventually be overwhelmed by the Galactic Empire. So, at the end of the day, I don't think the Jedi would have attempted to create any clones. They would have been better off just trying to take out Palpatine, which they failed to do. So guys, those are my thoughts of whether the Jedi Order would use cloning to save themselves or increase their numbers. Let me know in the comment section below what you think. Also, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button. As usual, thanks for joining us today. If you're watching this, you are Generation Tech.